It's time that we move forward and resolve the problems of our country. Let me, if I might, I know and I agree with my friend from Virginia that we got to find a way on both sides of the aisle to come together. But I must point out that it's been extremely difficult, particularly with the climate in the other body. In the current issue of New York Magazine, Jonathan Chait writes, and I quote, "The chaos and dysfunction has set in so deeply that Washington now lurches from crisis to crisis, and once dull, keep the lights on ritual of government procedures are transformed to white-knuckle dramas that threaten national or even global catastrophes. The Republican Party has spent 30 years careering ever more deeply into ideological extremism. But one of the novel developments of the Obama years is the embrace of procedural extremism. The Republican fringe has evolved from being politically shrewd proponents of radical policy changes to a gang of saboteurs who would rather stop government from functioning at all," end quote. Well, this brinkmanship is preventing the economic recovery from gaining steam. It's preventing us from addressing urgent problems, and it's punishing all Americans, not just federal workers. If we come together on behalf of the American people, we can replace sequestration with a measured and balanced approach to deficit reduction. We can agree on a path forward to fiscal solvency that spreads the burden equitably. We can begin to solve our problems instead of compounding them. But I will tell you what we cannot do. We cannot balance the budget on the backs of federal workers. It isn't feasible, and it isn't fair. Increasingly, federal workers are asked to do more with less. According to the Office of Management and Budget, the size of the civilian workforce relative to the country's population has declined dramatically over the last several decades, notwithstanding occasional upticks due to military conflicts or the taking of the census. In the 1950s and 1960s, there were on average 92 Americans for every federal worker. In the 1980s and 90s, there were 106 Americans for every federal worker. By 2011, the ratio had increased to 145 Americans for every federal worker. Since the 1950s and 60s, the U.S. population has increased by 76%, and the private sector workforce has risen by 133%. But the size of the federal workforce has risen by just 11%. Relative to the private sector, the federal workforce is less than half the size it was back in the 1950s and 60s. The picture that emerges is one of a federal civilian workforce whose size has significantly shrunk. Compared to the size of the U.S. population, it serves the private sector workforce and the magnitude of federal expenditures. I previously talked about the adverse effect of sequestration on many of our domestic agencies. I've talked a little bit today about the circumstances at NIH. I've talked about the Food and Drug Administration, the Social Security Administration, and other domestic federal agencies. So let me focus, Madam President, if I might, for the next few minutes on the impacts of sequestration on a particular group of federal workers. The Department of Defense civilian employees, who are part of the total force team providing invaluable support to our men and women in uniform serving in harm's way. These proud individuals have in the past few weeks suffered unnecessary hardship due to sequestration. The primary priority of our government is the defense of our nation, and sequestration adversely affects the civilian men and women who help provide that defense. DoD civilians serve our nation by advancing scientific research, providing logistical support to our service members while forward deployed, and ensuring institutional stability within DoD offices as service members rotate to different duty stations. Recently, some in the media have promoted the idea that the $85 billion sequestration cut triggered on March 1st aren't causing drastic effects. CNN called the cuts not as bad as advertised, and the Washington Post reported that the cuts are less scary than predicted. Tell that to the 46,000 DoD employees in Maryland and another 103,000 in the capital region who are being furloughed. losing up to 20% of their weekly pay through the rest of this fiscal year. Earlier this month, the Defense Department began furloughing 652,000 civilian employees nationwide, forcing them to take up to 11 unpaid days off through September. This is in addition to the furloughs at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the Internal Revenue Service. These furloughs disrupt our national and economic security and put hundreds of thousands of federal workers and their families in financial hardship. Our government cannot continue to provide for the defense of our nation by maintaining such a harmful policy towards our civilian workers. I have visited installations throughout Maryland, and I've heard about and seen the impacts of furloughs of Defense Department and other federal employees and the impact it will have on their ability to carry out their mission. These cuts and furloughs are affecting the ability of the agency to carry out their legal mission. For instance, at Indian Head Naval Service Warfare Center in Charles County, over 1,870 civilian employees, about 97% of the total government civilian workforce, are being forced to take leave without pay 1 day per week. This puts base police, fire protection, safety programs, air operations, air quality programs, and facilities at risk. At Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, furloughs will hit 2,400 Defense Department civilians, 94% of the civilian staff. Walter Reed is the country's top facility for wounded combat soldiers. Its Department of Orthopedics and Rehabilitation is the largest within the Department of Defense. Its 7 specialty service clinics include one for traumatic brain injuries. Soldiers needing expert care might have to wait longer for appointments or being forced to non-military medical facilities, both of which will drive up costs and compromise the quality of care. I can't tell you how many of us have taken the floor to talk about our commitment to make sure our service people get our warriors, our wounded warriors, get the type of treatment that they deserve. Many of us have visited the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center and with pride with the services that are being provided. Well, sequestration is hurting us to meet the mission that we promised to the heroes who have served our nation and have now come home and expect that health care to be available to them. At Fort Detrick, 4,900 Defense Department civilians will be furloughed. Those civilians support a multi-government community that conducts biomedical research and development and medical material management that includes everything from advanced bandages to vaccines for soldiers on the battlefield and in military hospitals. That mission is at risk. There is no other place that can carry out the type of advanced lab work that's done at Fort Detrick. Aberdeen Proving Grounds, Hartford County's largest employer and home to 11 major commands and more than 80 agencies, has approximately 11,500 DoD civilian employees subject to furlough, about half of APG's workforce. Before sequestration, APG reported contributing more than $400 million in payroll and $500 million in contract annually. I can assure you that community will be affected, and many businesses will be affected, as well as the mission at APG itself. And then very close to here, Madam President, just a few miles away at Fort Meade, Maryland's largest employer, sequestration is affecting the entire region. Most of its 27,000 DoD civilian employees face furloughs. These furloughs have all sorts of unintended consequences. A furloughed worker, for instance, may have trouble making his or her mortgage or car payments. Reduced creditworthiness may affect a worker's ability to maintain or obtain a security clearance. Is that how we want to treat people who've helped defend us from terrorists? Budget cuts compounded by sequestration will lead to a brain drain in the Defense Department, with some of the best and brightest defense professionals in the federal government deciding to seek opportunities elsewhere. The federal workforce is better educated, older, and more experienced on average than its private sector counterparts. A significant number of federal workers provide their services to the American people at discount. They could command higher salaries in the private sector. but they choose to work for the federal government because they are patriots and they believe in public service. The world is still a dangerous place. In such uncertain times, we cannot afford to let political dysfunction get in the way of ensuring for our national security. Sequestration is harming our national security readiness. Sequestration isn't just about compromising the ability of federal workers to carry out their critical missions on behalf of all Americans. And it isn't just hurting federal workers and their families economically. Private sector businesses and communities across the country are being hurt by the reduced purchasing power of furloughed federal workers. Federal workers are like everyone else. They support the local businesses in their communities, auto dealers, restaurants, dry cleaners, you name it. They all suffer when federal employees suffer. The local economies suffer, and the recovery becomes that much harder and slower. We need to stop demonizing and scapegoating and punishing federal workers. We need to replace sequestration with a rational budget. One of the greatest attributes of the American character is pragmatism. Unlike what some other federal employees are actually doing, here in Congress, balancing the budget is not rocket science. We know the various options. Former President Lyndon Johnson was fond of quoting the prophet Isaiah, "Come, let us reason together." That is what we need to do. We can acknowledge and respect our differences, but at the end of the day, the American people have entrusted us with governing and with being pragmatic. Let us do our job so federal workers can get back to do their job.